Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on sacred time and sacred rhythms. This is part two. We had part one last month where we talked about Advent and that being the beginning of the church calendar. And with that, how do we begin our spiritual formation by looking at the church calendar and then move into various dynamics of spiritual formation as we work our way through the church calendar into the next year, followed by, of course, at the end of the year, our next Advent, beginning the church calendar again. We had a wonderful webinar. If you have not seen that webinar, part one, I would encourage you to go to our Institute for Ministerial Wholeness website. That's www.imwholeness.org, and you can go to the events and events archives, and any and all webinars that we've done are then archived there. So you can go back and look at part one of this. And of course, we will archive today's webinar as well. And while I'm thinking about it, I want to go ahead and just say that next month, January, we're going to have a three-part series over January 8th, 15th, and 22nd on spiritual abuse. January is Spiritual Abuse Month. I didn't know that until last year when we had planned to do that series. And we are glad to have back Dr. Grant Jones, a psychologist, and Nathan Davis, a psychologist, and then also Dr. Beth Davis, a licensed counselor. And they, again, will be walking with us through three different webinars that we'll be doing on those three dates as we talk about what it means to be spiritually abused, how do you identify that, and then how do you know if you're a spiritual abuser? Because we don't want to leave anyone out in the sense of perhaps we are doing some things that we shouldn't be doing, and we need to be cognizant of that. And last year's series was very well received, excellent information, very much watched webinar series as well. So we just want to give you a heads up for the month of January. And you can register for those by going to the website again under events, and you'll see the three webinars and when they take place and what the gist of each one is going to be about. And so with that, I want to invite Pastor Matt Thomas of Solid Rock Church back. And Matt, I would like for you just to share a bit about yourself, but then to get into the content of our discussion today.
Great. Thanks, Mark. It is once again a joy, a delight to join you for this, what I believe is an incredibly important conversation. Um, it is, and that probably comes as no surprise because it is so uh, close to my vocational role in pastoral work. Um, my primary vocational role is pastoring a church in Springfield, Missouri, where I've been pastoring for a little bit over 13 years, during which time, as a congregation, we have explored together um, the importance of sacred time, exploring the liturgical calendar, um, and it has been an incredibly meaningful exercise for me personally, and I think from what I hear from many folks in our congregation. And so having just started another brand new year this past Sunday with the beginning of another Advent season, this is for many one of the most anticipated times of the year because we really get into some significant seasons in the church calendar. And so I'm excited about this conversation. I did want to mention, Mark, if I'm unable to see the chat box, so if there are questions, feel free to interrupt me. Or if you have something to add, please, if I'm just continuing to talk, just wave your hands or yell at me, because I do invite that. Um, if you joined us for the last session that we had in November, you remember that we spent the bulk of our time together during that session talking about a biblical foundation for, but also the what I believe to be the practical importance of something like sacred time that we see embedded in the liturgical calendar, these rhythms and seasons that I think help ground us in a story that is much bigger than our cultural or national or even our various familial stories. A constant reminder as we journey through each year that we're a part of a bigger story, that we are a part of a bigger church. So rhythms like those that the liturgical calendar lead us into, I think help us to begin to see each passing moment, even the ordinary, the quotidian moments, the normal sort of ho-hum of an average day as incredible opportunities packed with significance because they are opportunities for us to become aware of the presence of God, to see, know, and be with God in the ordinary rhythms of our lives. So the church calendar, one of the arguments that I made during our previous session was that the church calendar can become for us, to quote Annie Dillard, can become for us a net for catching our days, a net so that we can begin to take advantage of the significant opportunities that this day is offering to me, the important moments in this day for me to become who I am intended to become, which I think leads seamlessly into the conversation for today. So last time we focused on sacred time, that big concept. Today we narrow our focus a bit and drill down into the idea of sacred rhythms. And it's not as though these two can be entirely separated. They are actually interconnected in many ways, and I think that will be quite obvious as we progress during our time today. But the spiritual disciplines and practices that are historically firmly embedded within the various seasons of the church calendar. I don't think you can really understand the seasons of the liturgical year or understand the point of sacred time in general apart from these very specific spiritual exercises. So I mentioned that this conversation is really near and dear to my heart, really important to me, with, again, unsurprisingly, because it is a significant piece of the pastoral calling. Um, but I think the reason I think this conversation is so important has in part to do with how we understand. So to sort of zoom out and look at it from a 30,000-foot view, to how do we understand the ultimate point of the Christian life, of Christian faith in general, really the point of life in general. Um, I am convinced that Christian faith is not just a process or a transaction whereby we secure our ticket to a preferred afterlife. Christianity certainly has something critical to say about the age to come. It's an incredibly important part of the Christian faith. But if we reduce the Christian faith to the point where the whole purpose is just escaping something undesirable, I think that at the very least leads us to a sort of impoverished view of Christian faith and Christian spirituality. Because I think Christian spirituality at its core is being with God, knowing God, being shaped into the image of Jesus Christ. If we follow the grand sweep of the story told in our scriptures from beginning to end, I think this is what our scriptures teach. It all opens in the story told in Genesis in paradise, where life with God is the whole point. And that's how, if we fast forward to the very end of our scriptures, that's how it all ends in Revelation, a return, as it were, to paradise, a return to Jesus himself, a return to life with God. And so I think when we sort of diminish that fact, that the purpose of Christian faith is it's about life with God. If we diminish that and opt for sort of this reductionistic spirituality that is only concerned with escaping an undesirable final destination, I think I'm afraid that we will always have an impoverished spirituality because life with God is the point. And life with God actually begins now. It's not something that we wait until the age to come to pursue. So, our purpose in this life is exploring communion with Jesus Christ, our God. Now, I want to take a significant amount of time to explore some of the specific classical spiritual disciplines. But before we do that, I thought it might be worthwhile to mention just a couple of the potential roadblocks that many must overcome before being able to embrace this call into a life of spiritual formation. Or maybe a better way to put it is that there are a couple of dominant cultural realities or cultural assumptions, or at the very least, assumptions that in my pastoral work I have discovered assumptions that are becoming more and more pervasive, and they're assumptions that I think must be resisted if we are going to consistently pursue life with God. The first one is the idea that discipline is actually not important or not necessary or not even necessarily a good thing. That this is sort of the cultural air we breathe. I don't want to be constricted or restrained in any way by anything. That would be to impinge upon my personal freedom, and my personal freedom is my highest calling. That is the purpose of my life, to pursue my freedom. And to be honest, for those of us who are Americans, but we come by that honestly. I mean, that is at the core of the American project, this sort of rugged individualism. We live in the land of the free. So we do come by that honestly, but I think we have to come to terms with the fact that absolute freedom, or my pursuit of unending, uninhibited freedom, is in the end going to be its own devastating type of constraint. In a strange twist of irony, if we allow our pursuit of personal freedom to be the principal guiding force at work in our lives, the thing that we run every decision through, that filter of, is this going to make me more free, or is this going to maintain the freedom I have? If that becomes the filter that we run every decision through in our lives, I think we will find that we are ruled by actually an overwhelming tyranny of self-interest and self-obsession, which is always an incredibly destructive force. So, sure, freedom is important. I think it is actually an important component of living a flourishing, thriving life. But as people of faith, we can't slip into the mindset where freedom, my personal freedom, is pursued above all else. I think for very obvious reasons, because do you know what else is absolutely essential to live a flourishing and thriving life? Well, deep and personal relationships with other people, and deep, vulnerable relationships with other human beings is always going to necessarily limit my pursuit of personal freedom. I think of the closest relationships in my life, my relationship with my wife, my relationship with our two daughters. Those relationships limit my personal freedom in some really significant ways. But of course, I wouldn't trade that for anything. I wouldn't trade that for any amount of personal freedom because of the beauty and the life that those relationships bring into my world. They are invaluable to me. I I think about that old spiritual classic by Richard Foster, Celebration of Discipline. The opening chapter to that book, I've always loved the title that he chose for that chapter. um, which is the door to liberation. Um, I love it because I think it communicates something really important in this conversation, and that is that discipline, constraint, abstinence of various kinds, that yes, they are constraining and restrictive, but in a good way. They open us up to the possibility of a more robust kind of freedom in the end. So I think we have to resist that cultural pull that says discipline is actually not only unnecessary, but maybe even bad because it limits my personal freedom. So, as people of faith, we reject that premise. The second potential roadblock that many have to overcome, and this might have more to do with children and the transmission or passing of the Christian faith along to the next generation. But just as discipline is often seen culturally as a negative thing, I think I have found that discipling children at times, passing the faith down, can also be seen as a negative. I certainly see this at play in my generation and in generations younger than me. The thought is, well, I don't want to push my beliefs on my children. I don't want to indoctrinate my kids. I want to let them choose their own path. But the reality is that that's completely unrealistic, in my opinion, um, because formation, the children are being discipled. Formation is happening through intentional or conscious actions and habits. It's happening all the time. Children are being discipled. They're being discipled at school. They're being discipled by the media they consume. They're being discipled in the home, whether we recognize that or are approaching that in an intentional way or not. They are developing, but they're not developing in a vacuum. So they can't make completely rational decisions, objective decisions about the most important issues in life. Because formation is occurring. It is always occurring, which is
Now,
not just, by the
question.
way. Yeah,
Yes.
go ahead.
I don't want to interrupt you, but I need to. I just want to see if you want to answer this now or perhaps wait till later on in the webinar. But a question has come in from Dr. Daniel Day. Hello, Matt. My question for you is twofold, excuse me. One, do you have a particular spiritual discipline that you enjoy? Uh, Second question is, which one would be your most difficult to do regularly and why? Would you want to answer that now or postpone that to another point?
Maybe I'll go ahead and provide a short answer to both of those questions now. I
Okay.
think we will explore it in more detail in a moment, but I I I think my answer to that question is that I find all of the disciplines enjoyable in different seasons, but I also find all of them to be quite difficult in different seasons. And I think in many ways I have found that the spiritual exercises for me, they certainly do have a cumulative effect where the more I engage in a practice that is difficult in the beginning, the more I want to, and the more life that I find that it gives me. It's not entirely unlike developing an exercise regimen or training to run a marathon, although I don't know that from personal experience. I've never run a marathon, but um, I'm not going to go out and run 26 miles today. In fact, going out now and running 5 miles is going to be really unpleasant for me because my body is not trained for that right now. But I have spent significant time running in the past, and I have found in running that the more I do it, the more I want to, and the more I actually need it. Um, and I think in some similar ways, I find that the spiritual disciplines function in a similar way for me. Um, Fasting is one that is uh, difficult for me. In fact, I have explored that exercise at times throughout um, my life, but it wasn't really until about a year and a half ago that my wife and I started exploring it in intentional ways consistently, even weekly. I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to that. But even now, a year and a half in, it's still when I know that my day to fast is coming up, it's just like, oh, I there's something in me that resists that. But it's so life-giving. So the difficulty, that constraint, the thing I don't want to do, back to that earlier point, I do find that it is opening me up to a deeper, more robust sort of freedom. Does that answer or address that question?
Yes,
And
he does very well.
and I think I'll explore that in a little more detail when we get into some of the specific exercises. But so I think we must always remember that formation is occurring. It is happening. We are being formed into particular types of people. I am being shaped by a variety of influences. It may not be conscious formation, but I'm being formed. This is a really important point that in his recent book, Practicing the Way, John Mark Comer focuses a great deal on, and I think it's critical for us to wrestle with. We are formed by practices, habits. We're formed in the context of community, our relationships. We're formed by the media we consume. We're formed by the stories that we consume, the stories that we allow to shape our conceptions of what life in this world is about, that we allow to shape what our vision of the good life is going to be. So our hearts are being formed, our minds are being formed. Every one of us, we are shaped by a myriad of practices that we engage in. The challenge is that often we don't recognize that fact. We don't recognize the transforming power some of those practices might be having on us. And so we are engaged in what Comer refers to as passive formation, where we don't recognize what's happening. Christian discipleship is, in part, the process of engaging in intentional formation. So we're being formed passively. We want to um, do that intentionally. We want to take up habits and practices that are allowing Jesus to shape us through routine, through physical acts, through postures of body, uh, through various disciplines. Um, Years ago, James K.A. Smith wrote a book called You Are What You Love. I'm sure some of you have read that, but part of the argument he makes in that book is that our deepest desires as human beings are sort of manifested in our daily lives and our habits. And he said this. I went ahead and put it on a slide since it's a lengthy quote. He said, "This is because our action, our doing, bubbles up from our loves, which, as we've observed, are habits we've acquired through the practices we're immersed in. That means," he says, "the formation of my loves and desires can be happening under the hood of consciousness, so to speak. I might be learning to love a telos that I'm not even aware of, and that nonetheless governs my life in unconscious ways." He goes on to say, learning to love God takes practice. Learning to love God takes practice. That has always resonated with me and helped form the foundation for my pursuit of the spiritual disciplines. Rhythms of formation help build a foundation that makes it possible to love God, a foundation for Christ-like living. So if we want to become people of virtue, if we want to become people who reflect our Creator, to live in truth, to live in beauty and goodness, we must be intentional about tilling the soil of our lives so that when critical moments of decision present themselves, whether it's a moment of temptation or a moment where we have been invited into an action to do good in the world, the good that we ought to do, so that in those moments of decision, we will be prepared for that work that lies ahead. The British novelist and philosopher Iris Murdoch said this, that at crucial moments of choice, most of the business of choosing is already over. Crucial moments of choice, most of the business of choosing is already over because we have been formed and shaped into particular people who take a particular course of action in those moments. I want to submit that in incorporating the classical spiritual disciplines and allowing them to become the foundational exercises, that is absolutely essential if we hope to become the people we are called to be, people who have cultivated Christ-like character, because that doesn't just happen. It doesn't just, it's not automatic. So the question is, am I going to be intentional in my spiritual formation to ensure that the telos of my life is taking me in the direction that I think it's taking me? So I've heard somebody put it like this, there are no accidental saints. So I think we would all agree that we hope to become like Jesus. We hope at the end of our lives we are more like Jesus. That's certainly my prayer. That at the end of my life, I am more like Jesus than I am today in this moment. But that's not guaranteed. That's certainly not just going to happen. So if we agree that growing in Christ likeness is a principal concern of the spiritual life, we must then acknowledge that that's not automatic. And so I think it's helpful to think about who we want to be at the end of our lives. We probably all know people in the late stages of life who are the sweetest, most peaceful and Christ-like people we know. We probably also know people who are nearing the end of life who are crotchety and angry and spiteful. That didn't happen by accident. We end up in the place that the content of our lives, that the habits and rhythms of our loves, our pursuits have positioned us to end up. The 17th century Danish painter Rembrandt said, life etches itself onto our faces as we grow older, showing our violence, excesses, or kindnesses. If we want to become saints, if we want to look more like Jesus than we do now, we must put in the necessary work to get there. And as Dallas Willard has famously said, grace is not opposed to effort, grace is opposed to earning. Work and effort and discipline is necessary if we want the end of our lives to look more like Christ than they do now. Um, how, how are we on time, Mark? Should we go ahead and get into some of the specific practices?
Yes, we are at 11:30, so we're halfway through. So I think getting into some of the specific practices would be great. But this has been excellent. I just jotted down some things because what you said, I think, is so important. And for me, I wrote down initially what you're saying is really an attitude. What's my heart's desire? And then place. Is this about Jesus or about me? And then intentionality, um, a sense of this I must do. So even beginning the way you did with the denial of self, it's not about my pleasure, but it's about Jesus. It's about Him, and then all the blessings that go along with that. But very intentional. I thought it was an excellent, almost prologue, for what you're going to do now.
Great. And I that brings up another point that I think is worth thinking about, and that is that it I don't think the spiritual disciplines or exercises or practices in themselves are the point. The point is life with God. The point is that we might become aware of the presence of God that is never far from us. But so often, I am blinded to that uh, ongoing presence because of a busy to-do schedule or because of the noise that I am filling my mind with or the noise that's already active in my mind. Um, so the point is not to put a check mark in a box by these disciplines, um, but rather to engage in them so that we can enjoy life with God. And I think at times I have made the mistake of approaching it as, well, these are just things I have to do to be a good Christian. That's not the point. The point is I do these so that I can enjoy life with God, and be shaped into his image. So we'll start talking just briefly. And I teach a course at the local university where this conversation takes up about 6 weeks of the class. And so to distill it in just a few minutes is nearly impossible. So I'm just going to hit a couple of highlights. And then if you all want to talk more about any of this, I'm certainly open to that. Um, and we're not going to cover all of the classic spiritual disciplines, but just a few that I think are have significant roles to play in our observance of the liturgical calendar. The first one, the most obvious of the spiritual disciplines, of course, is prayer. I mean, everybody knows that to be people of faith means that we will be a prayerful people, a people who, in the words of St. Paul, are praying always. And it is a central part of all of the seasons on the liturgical calendar. Of course, it takes different shapes in different seasons, as we'll get into in a moment, but all of life is prayer. And I think central to many of the disciplines is prayer. It sort of undergirds all of the other disciplines. But I think there are a couple of important reminders that I want to offer. It's nothing novel. You probably are all aware of these, but these are things that I try to keep in mind, or I try to remind myself of, um, in my personal times of prayer. The first one is to avoid reducing prayer, um, to nothing more than a means of convincing God to do the things I think God needs to do. Um, in the way I think these things need to be done, in the timing I think they need to be done. Petition is certainly an important part of prayer, but it is only a part of prayer. And if we limit our prayer life to asking God to act in specific ways in our lives, I think our prayer lives will become deficient. Because I think the primary purpose of prayer, again, is to commune with God. Um, to abide in him, to delight in our life with God, to sit at the feet of Jesus and to be shaped into his image. So that's the first reminder that I try to keep in mind, that prayer is not primarily or certainly not only about trying to get God to do the things I think need to be done. The second thing is that I think our scriptures teach that we can and need to learn to pray well. We see this at work in Jesus' interaction with the disciples, where the disciples come to him and ask, Lord, teach us to pray. Just as John the Baptist taught his disciples to pray, would you teach us to pray as your followers? Now, that's a curious question because, of course, these are good Jewish boys. They know how to pray, but they want to learn. They want to grow in prayer as followers of Jesus. And I think this is a critical thing for us to keep in mind, that we learn to pray. We never stop learning how to pray. I think a good illustration of this is maybe a guitar soloist. So if I have this idea that I want to become, I think Foster might use this analogy in Celebration of Discipline. I know others have used it as well. But if I want to become a really proficient guitarist, where I can just jump into a jam band and wail and produce an incredible spontaneous guitar solo. Do you know how I don't end up doing that? I don't get there by just going down to the pawn shop, buying a guitar, learning a few chords, so that I can, play Wonderwall as a neat party trick. No, no, I have to learn music theory. I have to master the scales. I have to learn the language of the guitar. I have to constrain myself in some ways so that I can learn to go out on my own. And I think there is, if I want to be the next Eddie Van Halen, I have to function within some constraints. I have to learn the language of the guitar. And I think there's something similar at work in prayer. The disciples asked Jesus, Lord, teach us to pray. And what Jesus doesn't say is, well, just talk to the Father. You don't need to learn. No, he provides a model. He gives some very clear instruction. This is how you can approach prayer. This is how you can learn to pray well. There's a pastor in Missouri that I heard once say this, that we need prayers that are wiser than we are. We need prayers that are wiser than we are. And I have found that to be true in my life. As I have discovered, over a decade ago, the rich resource of the prayers of the early church fathers and mothers, I have found that they have helped provide for me prayers that are wiser than I am. He argued that if we always only ever resort to spontaneous prayer where we're praying whatever is top of mind, our prayers will often reflect the worst parts of who we are. So if I'm an angry person, I'll pray angry prayers. If I'm an anxious person, I'll pray anxious prayers. So I have found that I need something to sort of pull me out of those basest parts of who I am. So I need to learn to pray prayers that are wiser than I am. There's another idea that C.S. Lewis offers in his book. I'm blanking on the name of it. Letters to Malcolm, chiefly concerning prayer. He has this idea that he proposes of portable prayers, prayers that are short and succinct, small enough to sort of tuck away in your back pocket to take with you everywhere you go, a prayer that is always top of mind, so in that can sort of usher you into an awareness of the presence of God. That there are a variety of prayers that I have used in that fashion. Now, those portable prayers are not the end of the prayer life at all. That would be an incredibly deficient, especially, coming from a Pentecostal perspective, that would be an incredibly deficient view of prayer. But for me, they have often ushered me into an awareness of the presence of God and led me into deeper times of spontaneous prayer. So, one that I incorporate, that has been handed down to us as the church from centuries past is known as the Jesus prayer. I think I put it up here. The Jesus prayer, which is simply, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. This is a prayer that I return to every day, multiple times a day. Not in an attempt to convince God to extend his mercy to me as though God were reluctant to do so. No, this prayer is about my heart, about opening my eyes, to my need for mercy and to the mercy that is always waiting for me at the feet of Jesus. So let's move on from prayer. One type of prayer that involves silence and solitude. And this is actually a practice that the current season of the liturgical year, the season of Advent, I think in many ways invites us into, because during Advent, we are intentionally sitting in the darkness. We are intentionally sitting in the angst of waiting for the arrival of Christ. So we sort of reenact Israel's waiting. We symbolically wait in the tension of Israel's wait, but of course we also have our own waiting to do. And and we don't want to rush that. We want to we don't want to seek resolution to that tension too quickly. And one way that we do that during Advent is through the practice of silence, which enables some space for reflection, reflection on the true state of things, the true state of the world around us, the true state of my own heart, to take inventory, to be honest about that. Um, it is difficult to do that. It's difficult to have space for that kind of reflection if we are filling every void, if we are filling every moment with noise and to-do lists and activity. And I have found that even my prayer life can become, if I'm not careful, just another means of filling the void so that I don't have to sit in the silence of my own thoughts or the reality of who I am. I don't have to face the heaviness of my own personal issues or the heaviness of the issues at play in the world around me. So historically, for the people of God, the practice of meditation is one way to engage these disciplines of silence and solitude. And of course, meditation at times gets a bad rep, but I think that it's a mistake to ignore the centrality of this practice for God's people since the beginning. I mean, in Hebrew spirituality and Christian spirituality, in our Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, various words that are used to that are translated into English as meditation in the Old Testament occur close to 60 times. It's all over the place, especially in the Psalms. You know, one of those words that is used is the Hebrew word Haggah, which means to murmur or mutter or muse. And the image that brings to mind, this is another thing that Foster talks about in Celebration of Discipline. The image that brings to mind is that of a cow chewing the cud. Now, I'm not somebody who is exposed to the world of agriculture, but from what I understand, a part of a cow's digestive process is that they will take a bite, they will chew, they will swallow, they will regurgitate, continue chewing and swallow again. And this aids in that process of digestion. And I think that can be a really helpful image for what is taking place in meditation. You sit with something maybe even longer than it seems like you should. Certainly longer than you may want to, and you chew on it. You ingest, you choose some more, you sit with it for long periods of time. I once heard a story about a young lady who was visiting her grandfather in a nursing home, and she visited every day, but she visited one day and he was reading his Bible, and she asked what he was reading, and he told her the verse, and she didn't think much of it. They went about their conversation. She left. She came back the next day, found him in the same spot. Asked again, what are you reading in the Bible today? It was the same verse. And this happened day after day for a couple of weeks. And she was actually starting to grow concerned about his cognitive function. Like maybe there are more serious issues at play in his health. And so she questioned him, why are you reading the same verse? You've been reading that verse day after day for a couple of weeks. And his response was, I don't think God is done talking to me through this verse yet. that has always stuck with me. And I think it's a helpful way to envision meditation, uh, where it provides some space, enough silence for personal reflection, and provides space for us to actually hear God speak to us. There's a famous story told of Mother Teresa where she was asked by a journalist in an interview what she says when she prays. And her response was, I listen. What do you pray? What do you say when you pray? Her response was, I listen. It's a remarkable answer to think of listening as prayer, to think of silence where I'm not offering any words as prayer. Um, Another practice along these lines that Christians throughout the centuries have utilized, one that is a significant part of my spiritual practice, is the prayer of examen. In the prayer of examen, a part of Ignatian spirituality, um, a practice that typically occurs at the end of the day, where you place yourself in the presence of God, or more precisely, you hope to become aware of the presence of God that is with you, and you review your day, the moments of your day, and you invite God to actively show you the ways that He was present and active at specific moments throughout your day. Are there ways in which God is inviting you to repent or to rejoice or to reflect on His goodness? This is a means of becoming more self-aware, but also becoming more aware of God's presence. So it's not only a way that we review the day that is concluding right now, but it's also it becomes for us a way to prepare for the next day, the day that lies ahead. Um, so we'll move on to fasting. I'll just briefly consider this. I already mentioned this, probably one of my least favorite of the disciplines, and I'm sure that I'm not alone in that. Maybe some people enjoy it. I typically don't, especially when I first started exploring this practice consistently. John Wesley once said that some have exalted religious fasting beyond all scripture and reason, and others have utterly disregarded it. And I think the second half of that statement is the most common disposition in our day and age. It's utter disregard. And that makes sense because it's difficult. It's uncomfortable. And at times there isn't even necessarily an immediate benefit that I see when I fast in this moment. So why in the world am I participating in this? And I think there are a couple of important reasons. It becomes an opportunity to offer our entire selves to God, even our bodies, offering our bodies to God in worship. It's a way for us to worship God with our bodies. Again, this involves and requires a holistic view of our spirituality. The spiritual life is not just something that occurs in our minds, but it occurs with our entire selves. We are bringing our entire being before God. Some of the other benefits that I focus on in my practice of fasting is that it's an exercise whereby I learn uh, self-control. I willingly go without something that I need and something that is actually good, something that I desire and is a good gift from. I love to eat. I love delicious meals. Now, I love simple meals. I'll eat a peanut butter and jelly as well, but I love delicious food. I the first couple of years I was working as a pastor. I also worked full time at a chocolate factory just down the street from our church, a small batch bean to bar chocolate factory, and I grew to love craft chocolate. When I fast, I'm going without something that is good, something that I need, and something that is a gift to me. But I do that in order to place myself before Jesus, to learn deeper levels of self-control, um, and the discipline of abstinence. Um, Another reason, and this one is new to me, it certainly wasn't a part of my conception of fasting when I was growing up. It's new to me in the last year and a half, and it's one that again, John Mark Comer has brought to my mind, and that is seeing fasting as a practice where we stand with or identify with the poor. So when I am going without, and I in my practice, I typically do that on and Mark and I have talked about this. He has a similar practice, fasting on both or either Wednesday or Friday. This is a historic church tradition where we are entering into some significant points of the story of Jesus, the betrayal of Christ, and then, of course, his death on Friday. So we're connecting ourselves to the historic church and to Jesus himself. But when I face that day of fasting and when I feel the pain of hunger, the discomfort of hunger, there's an important reminder in that for me that millions of people around the globe, that is their daily reality. And so I think it can also become for us a tool that leads to increased compassion and opens our eyes to others that we may not readily think about. And then finally, it helps us identify with the suffering of Christ. I talked about this in the early tradition of fasting on Wednesdays and Fridays to identify with those significant moments in the Passion Week. Um, and this, of course, is one reason that fasting has become a central part of the Lenten season since its inception. Of course, some people will fast certain foods during Lent or participate in absolute fasts for certain days. But as we journey with Christ toward his cross during Lent, fasting becomes a way that we enter into that suffering and identify with it. And maybe it helps us to, as Pentecostals, at times, I don't know that we have a thoroughly developed theology of suffering, something that I think we could learn from our Catholic brothers and sisters. And I think fasting is a part of that process. Mark, I think I'm being too long-winded. So do you want to stop for question and answer since we're at just a few minutes left?
Well, this has been excellent. So, with what you just said, does anybody have a question they would like to direct to Matt, or a comment, or something that you have found very helpful in your own formation in what we've been talking about? I'll bring something in as people are thinking about it. As you and I were speaking the other day, I remember I was listening to someone share a very short sermon, and they were talking about the when yous of Jesus. And Jesus said, when you pray, when you give, and he said, when you fast. And the point that they made was that these are like absolute expectations that Jesus had. And I thought to myself, well, I give. I have no, yeah, I do that. I pray. Wow, let me see. When do I fast? It's usually if the pastor at church calls for a fast, or maybe there's a back against the wall moment. But then I began thinking about the early Methodist under Wesley, which the Wednesday and Friday, as you said, was the rhythm that they had to fast. And they would fast till 3 p.m. on Wednesday and Friday from the meal they ate the night before at supper through till 3 o'clock. But of course, they just weren't following something that they had ordained. Wesley had found it in the early church that this was the practice of the early church for the very reason that you gave, Matt. You know, the the Wednesday when he for trial, and then Friday the crucifixion. And I thought, I need to fulfill that when you. I mean, for me, it was something I need to fast, and I felt like it was a compulsion. And so I started doing that, and I have found it to be something I look so forward to now. And I too like to eat. But, you know, to me, I'm in the morning, and I work it into my devotional time. But then when I'm out, I have an office in another location. This is my home office I'm in now. But there's a local church just 3 minutes away from my office, and it's always open. And I called them and I said, I'd like to come to your church on Wednesday and Friday when I'm in town. and use one of the chapels for prayer. And they said, well, that's what they're all about. So you're welcome to come. I said, I'm not of your church tradition. And they said, that doesn't matter to us. You're a Christ follower. So that's what I do. And it's like I can't wait for that time. And I've also seen the Lord do some very powerful things as a result of that fasting, but more of it is a sense of all the things you've been talking about. It's almost like a purging of me. It's an elevation of Jesus. Jesus is becoming more real and personal and a focal point. And there's, like you said about fasting, that self-control dynamic, that identifying with the suffering of Christ, by denying ourselves. It's almost like a part of taking up our cross and following him as he said for us to do. So, and it goes back to the very point you made at the very beginning. It's not something I'm necessarily doing for me. I'm doing it for my relationship with God more than anything else, than any request I have. So it's just a thought. And I would encourage, if anybody wants to talk about it further, let me know. But think about Wednesday and Friday. And I fast till 3 o'clock, and usually I just wait until supper and have supper with my wife, or we have dinner plans. But it's just a wonderful exercise for spiritual growth. Nathan, please.
Yeah, my wife and I, in our journey of the spiritual disciplines, decided to take up fasting as one of them. Like I think most people, we found it be rather difficult. Um, and most of you don't know, but my most recent career was as a personnel research psychologist. So um, I had done a lot of personality measurement over the first year that we engaged in fasting. um, I but I found that my personality and my wife's personality changed in the area of conscientiousness, and actually our conscientiousness changed. It grew by 2 standard deviations, which is enormous because the research on personality change says that generally you will not change more than one full standard deviation over your entire lifetime, and that will take a major intervention to do that. Well, we both changed 2 standard deviations. Our conscientiousness increased. And so I concluded basically that God gives us that discipline for a purpose. And as we engage in conscientiousness, what we're doing is it is difficult. We are exercising a muscle, and that muscle of conscientiousness grows as we do something that's difficult. And that muscle gets stronger and stronger as we keep doing that thing that's difficult. And so our first year, we would engage in fasting on Friday. We'd eat breakfast in the morning and then not eat anything else until the following day in the morning. And it was interesting to see that our conscientiousness actually changed, and changed in double the maximum amount for a lifetime change. And it was only in that one particular part of personality. I've kind of concluded that God, maybe he gives us disciplines for a purpose. Perhaps it's our way of becoming more like him. As we engage in each discipline, perhaps God is doing something to our personality and to who we are that changes us in remarkable ways. Maybe God has a reason behind the disciplines.
Yes. I think with that thought, Nathan, there's a wonderful book that's titled What Your Body Knows About God by a fellow by the name of Rob Moll. It's an InterVarsity Press publication. And he actually goes into the dynamics, and you've done research on this, and I'm making this to your point about the standard deviations that change. You actually did a scientific psychological test for you and Beth, along with your spiritual practice, and this is what the results were. And to reinforce what you're saying, in Rob Knoll's book, What Your Body Knows About God, he talks about how Dr. Andrew Newberg at the University of Pennsylvania, which is an Ivy League school. It doesn't say that Newberg is a believer, but he's a neurologist and he has done testing. And with people who practice, going back to the element of what Matt has talked about with meditation and even calling it contemplative prayer, a time of silence and solitude, that people who practice silence and solitude for up to 20 minutes a day, that several things happened. And I'm going to make the first point to your point. They have a greater compassion for others. So there's this element of being silent that creates a greater compassion towards others. There was an enhanced spirituality that came out of their silence and solitude, and how near and how open they felt with God in their relationship with Him. And then he said, and he had electrodes attached to the person's heads who did this, that during contemplative prayer or meditation, there was increased synapse activity between the neurons in the brain. And they actually strengthened and compounded as people consistently did this. So it is remarkable how we are not chopped up into pieces as God's imago Dei. We are very much a holistic people. We need to be looking more of a Hebrew mindset than a Greek mindset of being separated into body, mind, soul, spirit, but we are functioning together. And how these things not just impact our spirituality, but they really impact our physical well being as well, and then our relational well being to other people. So I believe this is just a wonderful way to enter into the new year, to consider and contemplate the things that we've talked about in November's webinar, part one, and then today's webinar, part two. And we'll be looking to expand on this. I really believe that we should. There's a definite hunger for celebrating what we have. And I'm from a Pentecostal tradition, the Assemblies of God. Matt pastors in Assemblies of God Church, Solid Rock. Most of us here are of that church tradition, but we rejoice in the elements that we have from that tradition and the theology of it. But also, the church is very historically deep, and the church is also kingdom of God very wide. And there's so much to learn and to glean from our sisters and brothers of other traditions that only feed us and grow us to become more like Jesus, which is our ultimate goal. And so as we bring this to a conclusion, Matt, I want to bring this back to you. Is there anything that you would like to say as we wrap up our time today?
No, I mean, other than begin where you are. Just begin. Begin exploring these practices. You don't have to master them. In fact, we will never master them. It's not about arriving at a destination where we have achieved mastery in any particular discipline. This is something that we are learning and growing in for the rest of our lives. So just
Yes.
begin where you are.
And I will just say in conclusion, I've included another book in here by Basil Nortz, and the name of the book is Holy Silence, A Practical Guide to Recollection with God. And you can get it on Amazon. And I've really entered into contemplative prayer myself, and just the wonderful benefits. I find that to be my favorite part of prayer, is being in silence with God and just letting Him love me, and just the deepening of that relationship when I'm just seeking Him in the raw with nothing else, no music or anything else in the background, just that silence. And it's, the old saying goes, silence is golden, especially with God. And so I would encourage you. I am finding this book, I'm using it in my own devotional time in the morning. And it's one of those kind of books you don't want to plow through. On one hand, I would love to just read it cover to cover, because every chapter I spend more time highlighting on my Kindle than I words than I leave unhighlighted. But I wait till the next day because I just want to receive. And today was silence and imagination. And I was so blown away by what he wrote about the imagination and how the enemy seeks to control our imagination and the things we feed our imagination with, that is so contrary, and then how it can control us as opposed to, whatever things are pure, godly, good, so forth, and as Paul talks about. But anyway, I want to highly recommend that book. as well. And then Matt also shared a number of different texts I wrote down. Some we are very familiar with, like the Lewis books. But thank you so much, Matt, for the time today. Um, I've greatly benefited from it. I know those that are online today that have been a part of it and those that will watch this webinar also will benefit greatly. We'd love to have you back in the future, and I hope that you would agree to that. And then also just a reminder, coming up in January, we're going to have a three-part series on each Wednesday, the 8th, the 15th, and the 25th, excuse me, I said 22nd before, the 25th of January, and doing a three-part series on spiritual abuse for those that have experienced spiritual abuse and those that may have participated, or maybe they don't even know that they are a spiritual abuser. A very important topic in many facets of the church today. And so I would encourage you to sign up for that. You can do that, and then to let others know as well. And so with that, we want to say goodbye and have a Merry Christmas. It's great to have you all on today, and those that will be watching in the future, thank you. And so with that, we'll say goodbye and God bless you. Take care.